Hi guys and welcome back to my channel. The case that I'm going to be looking into today is the case of Candy Rogers. This case would actually go unsolved for decades and decades, basically until our technology caught up and we were able to test DNA found on her body, and that finally revealed what happened to her fully. Well, who did this to her at least. This case was suggested by Donald, so thank you for that. I appreciate any suggestions you guys have, and of course if you do have any more, please do let me know. Also, just a little disclaimer here before I get into it. It is a child case. It involves a death of a child and the sexual assault of a child. So if these videos aren't for you, then please just go ahead and find a different one. Candice Elaine Rogers was born in 1950 to Mother Elaine. Now, I'm not entirely sure of her father's name. I couldn't really find that. And I do know that the pair did end up getting a divorce. But they lived in Spokane in Michigan. Now, Elaine was actually a high school history and a PE teacher. And I do know that her father, whoever he was, actually lived in Oregon and worked in sales. Candy was an only child, so she was the sole child, and Elaine was also an only child, and she actually lived next to her mother. So Candy and Elaine lived next to her, well, essentially Candy's grandparents and Elaine's mother. So when it would make it really easy that when her mother wouldn't be in work or have to do something, you know, she would just go and stay over literally next door at her grandparents' house, and they would watch her and look after her. Candy attended Holmes Elementary School. She was actually a member of the Campfire Girls of America, and because she was so young, she was 9 at the time, and she was so small, she was actually a bluebird. So I guess she wasn't a fully fledged member yet because she was so young, and you know, she was what they would call a bluebird. And because of that, it kind of brought out her sort of entrepreneur skills. Like, she would go out and she would have to sell all these things to people, and it was just like budding for her, and it sort of jumped her a little bit out of her shyness. So the day in question was like any other day, as it normally is. Candy went to school. It was a Friday afternoon on the 16th of March in 1959. She then finished school at 3:15. By 3:30, she was at her troop leader's house picking up these Campfire Girl mints. Basically, this was the first day of selling, and she really wanted to become like a fully fledged member. You know, that was her aspiration to do eventually. But she was actually competing for this sales badge. Basically, a number of girls were competing for this sales badge, and it would earn them a free week in like a summer camp. So that's what they were all competing for, and that is what Candy really wanted. She wanted to get this sales badge and be the best seller in the place so that she could, you know, get this week in camp. Well, be in the running for it, I believe. I don't know whether it was actually given to the person that won. Probably put her in like her name in the hat so that they could pick someone out of that, I guess. I'm not entirely sure on that. She goes there, she collects these boxes, but because she's quite small for her age, she ends up only being able to take 7. So neighbours actually recalled seeing her sort of bumbling down the road holding all these boxes. She then heads to her grandmother's house, really. So she heads there, and she's got 30 minutes to try and waste away before she can officially start selling these mints, which was 4 o'clock. So she shares a cookie with her grandma. She begins playing with her dog, which was called Ship, and you know, she was just basically killing the time. And then you best believe that when 4 p.m. hit, she was out there selling to neighbours. Trying to sell to neighbours. At around that time of year, it gets dark by about 20 to 6-ish, and Candy knew that she had to be home by the time the street lamps turned on. So really, she didn't have a ton of time to sell these, and she knew that she had to be home by then. Now, her mother actually had a hair appointment that day, which is why she was late coming home. So she didn't come straight home after work because she went and had her hair done, which is why Candy was with her grandparents. And she gets home, and Candy is still not home, which obviously is frightening and surprising because she expected her little girl to be there with her grandparents, and she just wasn't. It was getting dark at this point. Her family were really worried about her, so the adults decide to all go out and split up and search for Candy. You've got Elaine, you've got, you know, her parents out looking. There were some people in the community that joined, and they were all out looking for her. And then obviously the police were informed, and then the scale of the search really vamped up after that. It was basically said that the search efforts was something that Spokane had never really seen before. Like, it was huge. They did everything, and there were tons of people out looking for Candy. Over the next 16 days, hundreds of people were out looking for her. We had Marines, airmen, even military aircraft were all out looking for her. There were police on foot, on horseback. There was the community on foot. Even a helicopter from one of the air base joined the search. It was looking through, like, shining the torch down onto the river, I believe. And like, even the search was struck with tragedy for Candy. Like, this little girl had gone missing, which is heartbreaking enough. And then the people out looking for her hit tragedy too, which just, honestly, is just such a horrible bad stroke of luck, because they ended up hitting these power lines above. The helicopter literally crashed, and then there were 5 people on board, and it killed 3 of them. On the final week of the search, it was estimated that there was 1,200 people out looking for Candy. We had people from, you know, the Girl Scouts, the Boy Scouts. There was, honestly, just the search efforts to try and find her were enormous. And they did actually come across, well, what they thought to be her boxes of mints strewn along the road. But there was just no sign of Candy. They found that heading towards, I believe it was out of town actually, but they just didn't find anything else. That was until the 21st of March 1959. 2 off-duty airmen hunting in the woods about 7 miles away from Candy's home noticed a pair of blue children's shoes by a tree. The next morning, police returned to the area to scout around, and that is when they found Candy's body. 16 full days after Candy had gone missing, they finally had found her. But not in the way that anybody wanted, obviously. Her body was hidden by pine and brush. And she had been sexually assaulted. She had been strangled with a piece of her own clothing. She also had a piece of her clothing tied around her ankles, I believe. And they also found marks around, like, her waist, as if she'd been tied with a rope at some point. But they never found anything like that around the scene. So whether this person did that and then took it with them, I don't actually know. But they just didn't find a rope there that would have sort of coincided with that. Not to say that it didn't happen, obviously. And the crime absolutely just shocked the community of Spokane. It honestly, it just riled them so much. There's always this thing where people think that their towns are safe, and then something horrible happens and they realise that actually maybe they're not. And it's just so heartbreaking, especially when it happens in your town, and especially when it's a child. So the police were now looking into a murder investigation, and hundreds of tips came pouring in, but none of them led to Candy's killer. Oh, something I forgot to mention actually. What they did discover on Candy's body was some DNA evidence. They discovered some semen, but obviously this is the 50s. They didn't have, like, technology to process that at the time. You know, they just couldn't do it. And so they did preserve all of that, which is amazing, and thank God they did. Preserved it as best as they could, so that, you know, when hopefully as the years go down, technology improves, and maybe that they could catch somebody off that. But decade after decade passed, they got no closer. They did not have a clue who did this horrific crime to Candy. It was actually described by Spokane police that it was their Mount Everest of cold cases. They couldn't really seem to overcome it, and nobody could seem to forget it. Though obviously detectives did make progress along the way, you know, as technology improved, they did make some findings. More than 40 years after the crime, investigators were actually able to isolate the DNA off of Candy's clothes. And this would actually rule out one of pretty much the only suspect that they had for a while. The suspect that they had assumed this may have been, who may have done this horrific crime, was a man called Hugh Morris. He actually turned out to be a serial killer. Like, people didn't know who he was, really. If you would have asked anyone, they would have thought he was this upstanding, you know, really nice guy. But he wasn't. He turned out to be a serial killer. He always denied having anything to do with Candy's case. But, you know, that just because they deny it doesn't mean they didn't do it. But this DNA, which they later did retrieve, did actually clear his name because it did not match him. So he did not do it. Despite it clearing his name, it didn't turn up any matches in the federal database, so they were just no closer to finding Candy's killer. They had knocked one name off the suspect list, but, you know, it didn't bring up another name, unfortunately. Her case remained unsolved for more years to come. It really did impact the way that Spoken worked because, you know, they would no longer let their children just roam around freely. Again, Candy was told to come home by dark, but I guess they just didn't let really young kids out anymore after that. Like, because she were out selling mints and she was taken and assaulted and murdered, and that is just horrific. So obviously they put in sort of measures and things to try and prevent anything like that happening to their children or ever happening again. Then a new detective started working on the case in 2011. I believe it was Detective Starman. And he continued to look into the tips for years and years, and nothing really came of it. But then in 2021, he finally found a breakthrough. He had finally found a forensic lab that was willing to test the DNA found on Candy's body, well, on her clothes. Because the previous year, 2020, he'd attempted another lab to go to it to sort of look at this DNA, but they actually refused. They said that the DNA was too degraded to work with and they wouldn't do it. So luckily, you know, at this point he's thinking, will this case ever get solved? Will I ever find a lab that's going to look into this DNA? And he did, thankfully. He carried on reaching out to the labs, and he did find one, which was a Texas-based company called Othram. And they were able to build a genealogical profile to help narrow down the potential suspects of who it could have been. And that really narrowed it down. It narrowed it down to one family of 3 brothers. One of those brothers was called John Ray Hoff. Now, John Ray Hoff was no longer living. At the age of 31, he had actually taken his own life by shooting himself in the head, and he was 31 years old at the time. At the time of when Candy was murdered, he would have been 20 years old. They're looking into these brothers, and John is no longer here, having committed suicide. So now he is a suspect in the case, along with the other brothers. When Kathy Hoff, one of his daughters, finds out that her father is actually a suspect in the horrible sexual assault and murder of a 9-year-old little girl, she actually contacts the police and willingly comes forward with like a sample of her DNA, allowing them to take that to see whether it matches to her father, basically. This DNA test showed that it was 2.9 million times more likely that her father, John, was Candy's killer. But in the detective's eye, that wasn't a cert. So what he wanted to do was basically exhume John's body. Now, in a horrible twist of fate, John had actually been buried in the same cemetery as Candy, which is just so sad because he was the one that killed her. But obviously no one knew that. When John died, people thought he was this upstanding man. Nobody knew the truth, not even his own family. They actually managed to exhume his body, and they take the DNA samples from there, and that pretty much certified that John was the one that murdered Candy all them years ago. 62 years ago, to be exact. And in November of 2021, it was finally revealed that they had solved this cold case of 62 years of poor Candy Rogers, and that John Ray Hoff was the one that had killed her. It had finally brought some sort of relief to Candy's remaining family. This cold case had finally been solved. They finally found out what happened to their relative. The sad thing is that her grandparents and parents were no longer alive at this point, and that she was their only granddaughter and that her only daughter, and the fact that they actually passed away without ever finding out what happened to her is just, I always find that aspect in cases really devastating, but at least the case was solved eventually. Just unfortunate that they never got to see and find out who did this to their child and grandchild. And not only that, it also brought sadness and shock to the Hoff family, because the police had to tell his widow and 4 children that he, all them years ago, had sexually assaulted and murdered a child. And can you imagine how horrific and shocking that must have been for them to find out that their father and husband was capable of doing something like that? Like, it must have just been so awful. And now, not only that, they have to live with that. I know it's not the children's fault, it's not the wife's fault, you know, I'm not saying that, but I can imagine, and if it was me, just how much you would think about that, and how much you would think that, like, you wouldn't have thought your father was capable of that, and then to know that he did that honestly, it must just be so awful. Kathy spent most of her life thinking that her father had died by suicide because he was depressed. You know, again, he died a well-respected man. But coincidentally, or not, maybe, he actually took his own life when Kathy was about to turn 9, which was the age that obviously Candy was and was killed at. So, I don't know. I guess he just couldn't take it anymore and just decided that he would end it himself. John Hoff actually grew up in Spokane. He did have a record, but it was just like petty juvenile crime. He served in the army when he was 17, and again, he was 20 when Candy was killed. Where he was actually positioned in the army was just outside of his town, so, you know, he literally lived very close. Then in 1961, he was actually convicted of grabbing a woman, undressing her, tying her up with her own clothes, trying to strangle her before fleeing. Luckily, this woman did survive, thankfully, and John ended up serving 6 months in jail for it. As a result of that, he was declared a deserter and he was actually discharged from the army. And then he went on to do various jobs. He jumped from job to job, he worked in a lumberyard, he did sales, things like that. It isn't really known if John actually knew Candy beforehand, but what is known is that his stepsister, who was 10 years old at the time, was Candy's big sister in the Campfire Girls. So whether he actually met her through that or whatever, whether that made it easier for him to lure her in because she knew not to talk to strangers, but maybe she met him before through her big sister or something like that, or maybe he said, well, I know her, she's my sister, it's fine, and then she was more trustworthy. I don't know. His stepsister is now in her 70s, and the detective actually went ahead and spoke to her, and she actually recalled how she sat there crying and telling John, her stepbrother, how devastated she was over Candy's death. As I've said, John Hoff was buried in the same cemetery as Candy, but then his body was exhumed and his family decided to then bury him back in a different cemetery, which it's really nice of them, you know. He murdered Candy. Her family won't want him buried in the same cemetery as her. Kathy then went on to say, I'm very, very sorry for what my dad did. He took her life horribly. I hope it gives her peace, knowing that even though it's not really justice because he doesn't get any punishment, but that his name has this on it now and that they know that it is solved. So yeah, this case was absolutely tragic. Candy lost her life to a sexual predator who then couldn't take it anymore and took his own life. But I am so glad that with technology and with them preserving that DNA for so long, that they were finally able to solve this case. Candy's family can get some relief from that, and my heart goes out to both sets of families. The Hoff family that basically didn't know that their family member was capable of anything like this and that he took an innocent little girl's life, and that's obviously gonna haunt them, which is it's just so tragic. I can't even imagine finding out something like that. I really can't. So yeah, we have to praise DNA technology, which is so amazing these days. It's getting so many of these cold cases solved, and we can't show enough gratitude for that. But yeah, that is the end of the case. If you guys have enjoyed this video, give me a big thumbs up, subscribe to the channel for similar content. Anyway, that's all I have today on the case of Candy Rogers. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, bye.